Mr. Speaker, it's been a very long time that since the cancelling of the funding of the Sisters in Spirit for the Native Women's Association of Canada, have been calling for a national public inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. Indeed, in 2010, Anita Neville and Todd Ross made sure that it was clear that there needed to be a national public inquiry in order for us to get to the bottom of what this horrible, horrible tragedy was all about. Later, the AFN and the Native Women's Association called for the national public inquiry, and it has become clear to everyone across this country, except to this Conservative government, that Indigenous women and girls are dramatically more likely to be victims of homicides and to go missing in Canada. In fact, while only 4% of women in Canada are Indigenous, this demographic counted for a staggering 23% of female homicide victims in 2012. This means almost 1 in 4 female murder victims in Canada are Indigenous. The RCMP statistics identified almost 1,200 victims since 1984, doubling the previous Native Women's Association Canada estimate. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it was a year and a half ago on February 14th when we debated in this House the need for a special parliamentary committee. It was because of that special parliamentary committee that the RCMP actually picked up the phone and called other levels of policing and found out that their unbelievably low estimate was extraordinarily higher than they had thought, at almost 1,200 victims. This epidemic of violence must end, and the Conservative government, which claims to be tough on crime and stand up for victims of crime, cannot continue to ignore this national disgrace. The government's recent so-called action plan simply implements the whitewashed recommendations of the Conservative-dominated Special Committee on Violence Against Indigenous Women. In fact, that report ignored all of the recommendations of the witnesses that we had heard from and put in place a laundry list of things they were already doing that they thought were sufficient when clearly it is not sufficient. These piecemeal government initiatives that were articulated in their so-called action plan has listed many things that were not even specific to Indigenous women and girls. For instance, the $25 million of so-called new money is simply a re-announcement of the funding of Budget 2014, which is in fact simply an extension of the temporary funding of $25 million over 5 years, first announced back in 2010. This kind of political smoke and mirrors is why a national action plan must be rooted in a nonpartisan national investigation into why this problem has persisted for decades and why all of us in this House recognize that successive governments have been unable to fix it without articulating the facts. The Prime Minister's stubborn refusal to call a national public inquiry into this ongoing tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is in stark contrast to the overwhelming consensus in Canada. The Prime Minister is on the wrong side of history. Grieving families, Indigenous leaders, opposition parties, victims advocates, civil society, and every single provincial and territorial premier have all urged the government to call a national public inquiry. The Prime Minister's opposition is ill-considered and short-sighted and is killing people. We can and must rise to this challenge and call a national public inquiry now.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for the Status of Women.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, let me be clear that these abhorrent acts of violence against Aboriginal women and girls will not be tolerated in our society. Canada is a country where those who break the law are punished, where penalties match the severity of crimes committed, and where the rights of victims are recognized. That's why we committed an Economic Action Plan 2014 to invest an additional $25 million over 5 years to continue efforts to reduce violence against Aboriginal women. On September 15th, the Minister of Labour and the Minister for Status of Women released the Government of Canada's Action Plan to address family violence and violent crimes against Aboriginal women and girls. It responds to the call for action from families and communities and addresses the recommendations of the Special Committee on Violence Against Indigenous Women, and that is what our government is doing. We are taking action. There are three main areas in which our government is taking action. First, the Government of Canada is taking action to prevent violence against Aboriginal women and girls. Specific actions set out in the action plan include development of more community safety plans across Canada, including in regions the RCMP's analysis has identified as having a high incident of violent crime perpetrated against women and girls. Projects to break intergenerational cycles of violence and abuse by raising awareness and building healthy relationships. And, Mr. Speaker, projects to engage men and boys and empower Aboriginal women and girls to denounce and prevent violence. Second, the Government of Canada is taking action to assist and support victims of violence. Specifically, the action plan supports family and police liaison positions to ensure family members have access to timely information about cases, specialized assistance for victims and families, and positive relationships and the sharing of information between families and criminal justice professionals. Third, the Government of Canada is taking action to protect Aboriginal women and girls. Specifically, the action plan includes initiatives such as funding shelters on reserves on an ongoing basis, supporting the creation of a DNA-based missing persons index, and continuing to support police investigations through the National Centre for Missing Persons and Unidentified Remains. The Government of Canada will also continue to work closely with provinces and territories, police services, and the justice system, as well as Aboriginal families, communities, and organizations to address violence against Aboriginal women and girls. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for St. Paul's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yet again, the Parliamentary Secretary and the Government of Canada continues to disappoint. In fact, it continues to disappoint by continuing to use the word continue. That again, it's as though everything they're doing now is perfect, and this tragedy continues. He talks about funding shelters. There are 44 shelters in over 600 First Nations in this country. This is not good enough. We have not seen any commitment to an increase in resources, and I think the people of Canada, the families and the friends of the victims of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and frankly, the 96% of Canadians not from an Indigenous background are frankly fed up. They do want to see action. They know it only begins with a national public inquiry that will get to the facts and be able to determine action that will work. Mr. Speaker, we will not let up on this, and we hope that the government will come on side. If not, we'll wait till the next government and we'll do it. Hear, hear.
The honourable parliamentary secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I probably wouldn't hold my breath if I was the colleague opposite. The investments being made by the Government of Canada to address violence against Aboriginal women and girls are very significant. The action plan released by the Minister of Labour and Minister of Status of Women on September 15th includes new funding of $25 million over 5 years, beginning in 2015-16. There is further ongoing funding of $158.7 million over 5 years, beginning in 2015, for shelters and family violence prevention activities. There will also be an internal dedication of $5 million over 5 years, beginning in 2015, to improve economic security of Aboriginal women and promote their participation in leadership and decision-making roles through Status of Women Canada. Measures outlined by the Minister in the Action Plan represent a total investment of nearly $200 million over 5 years. Mr. Speaker, I don't understand why my honourable colleague opposite she's sounding so concerned about this. However, she never supports anything we do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.